do we need to start thinking and teaching about the fuzziness so that we can understand that better in order to actually interface with the computing that's happening?
You know, I'll take a stab at it. Do you guys hear me? You know, Alan Turing wrote about AI, what, 45 was it? Like, well, over 50 years ago, right? And he already had kind of imagined what this machine could be or try to be or become. But partially it was more of this kind of, it does come back to this philosophical, almost, let's say, reflection of what we are. Like, we barely know what humans are. So why would we know what to make these machines? And what would you even want them to do? And I think a lot of the things been just ways to, let the machines do certain problems. And the things that's been addressed so far are not the basic ones, but the stuff that we need to have solved, like make wider roads or faster things. Those are fairly clear problems. But when you look at the whole spectrum of human questions, there's much more broad questions, and I don't think the computational resource has been distributed evenly for those things.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about this is, this goes back to the information theory of mind, thinking that our mind, or us, we operate like computers, right? So actually it's vice versa, right? So like trying to define what a computer is what it does, was kind of like thinking about human mind. Okay, what happens? I look, I see, and I then define if it is this black or white, and kind of like, which goes back to that analytical knife. And then from there on, actually, as humans, we do whatever we can do, right? So like whatever we cannot do, we cannot address most of the things that I was trying to share today because we couldn't, or somebody made a bad decision at some moment, right? So, and then we kind of like, we got stuck with whatever we are using today. And to go back to your question, I think definitely yes, because I don't think the devices or our approach to computing is acknowledging our true potential, which is our intelligence, which doesn't reside only in our mind, but it also exists in our hands, in our environment, and like everything around us.
I know, James, you mentioned talking about you work with robots where they needed to be precise and accurate every time, but now you're working with robots where you're trying to make them not precise and accurate every time. You're introducing fuzziness into that.
Well, I mean, we still have to make our parts correct, right? So there isn't the ability to make them fuzzy. Architects would be unhappy about that. And my topic feels a little bit pedestrian now, but there is something nice about working at Zaner. And there was some audio that unfortunately I missed, but the punching machine is sort of the heartbeat of Zaner, right? Like when it's punching, we have work, and there's people working. And it's an old discussion about interfaces between humans and machines. And you can look at Marx talking about these men, chained to these machines during the Industrial Revolution. And so the UI still is a serious issue at a very mechanical level too, because it means somebody sits there and clicks. It means somebody is spending hours and hours doing these menial tasks. Versus if we can think more about the human element and how they interact with it. Yeah, I think it's an imperative.
Are there any questions from the audience? Don't be shy.
Uh-oh. You guys scared him away.
No. I'll segue into another question. So I know there's a lot of educators within the audience. I also teach as well. A lot of times we teach form, we teach space, we program, so on and so forth. There was a time where we deviated and we started to teach software applications, and I think that was a bad idea. But how much do you think as educators do we need to teach individuals some of this fuzziness and to capture that fuzziness as part of the real world to kind of inform what we design and what we build?
It's interesting to see the previous talks and about trying to quantify this just vast amount of data, because it is inherently fuzzy, right? Like you can interpret the data all these different ways. And, I was in the Proving Grounds ML session and talking about classifications of this fuzzy data that's inherently, and point clouds are obviously very fuzzy, but I think it is fuzzy, is making it clear. And what parts you choose to keep fuzzy is for me the open question. I love the interface and the interactivity of that.
You know, I think the question of how interface shapes us is so non-discussed. Is so, and this is probably what you were speaking a lot about, is that you don't take into account like how we're nurtured culturally. And this is where technology and humans, to an extent, aren't separable. So we can't just talk about technology. And when you see slides without humans in them, it's kind of scary because it's like chopping off half of the body and just discussing the whatever mechanics of it. So I think humans do have a long history with technology and how it's evolved. But currently, it's partially to do with so sophisticated marketing and products of like, you know, Apple products looks amazing, but we don't think twice what we reduced or left out in the transition. And I think as the kind of future visioners or designers, right, that we have to understand that, and again, it is like a cyclical thing, so you're trying to reshape that, so therefore it's another paradigm. But if you're not acknowledged of that, you're within that paradigm. So to that bell curve, you're on the curve instead of finding new possibilities which are out there.
I mean, about teaching, I'll step back there and also like professionally, kind of like for my practices too. We of course have to do it, right? So we have these tools, we have the gadgets, we have the computers as they are, and the available kind of like set of tools that we can use. And some of them we appreciate more because they open up the world more flexible. Some of them kind of like crash more and then, you know, makes you unhappy and so on and so forth. But of course, like this kind of fuzziness cannot be handed directly, right? So I am kind of like pushing the discussion, but I have like clear intentions for that. Otherwise, you know, we of course need descriptions. We always need, of course need like stability. We have to know how to make things and teach those things. And then, okay, well, things are working now, then okay, you know, actually when you look at how the world or life works or how the history has changed, there are a lot of like, you know, fuzzy impacts, like bam, something like big event. So, okay, how can we make a big event possible? So that should be the part of the discussion in teaching too. So.
Cool. Any questions? Still shy? All right. What about in terms of what we can do to remove ourselves from the computer and interact more? So we spend a lot of time at these keyboards. I am guilty of it myself, right? We need to produce things. We need to produce spaces. We need to produce buildings. Because I mean, that's where we're in the AEC Tech space, well, except for, you know, a couple of folks here. But like in the end, how can we remove ourselves, or what advice can you give to remove ourselves from, you know, these keyboards and actually be able to put ourselves in this space where what we have perceived has become reality, and understand kind of the value of what that fuzziness could have been to us? Kind of like there was an earlier question of for the WeWork folks, like, have you taken some of your analysis and brought it back into the real space and actually been into the real space? So can we take ourselves away from the computer to realize what this fuzziness should be like? Do you guys have any suggestions, or you're going through your own processes?
Well, in the animation I was showing of all these panels kind of zooming through, there was an embedded tacit knowledge in that, right? Unless you have the information from the operator and the people who know the material really well, you can't program the machines well. And so there's a loop there that's really critical. Otherwise, you're programming things you don't understand, which is not a great thing. So, and maybe that ties to education. I mean, there's sort of an arms race of robots and machines all over the world right now within architecture departments, and I think that is really a call to arms to learn about the material and to get physical with it, and then use that information to, affect your design and change.
It's a hard question. I'm trying to removing oneself. I feel like as a software developer, this is probably the worst. You are your worst UI tester, because you've coded it, you know exactly how it should perform, and you think it's perfect, and you give that device to someone, it instantly shows all your flaws, and maybe that's my way of replacing myself out of the kind of process, is that fresh eyes, fresh memories, certain things beyond expertise is actually super useful in design development. And funny enough, it's one of those things, like once you've seen it, you can't go back. Like that's how our brain works. It's a little bit different from just raw memory. But I think those are actually vital even in thinking of algorithmic processes, because you get so invested in a process, but you never think about handing it over to someone. And I think that's when you truly discover something. Because until then, you are your master of your domain. You know every bit of what you've just created. So the suggestion is that you have to let go and receive that feedback. The more, the better, because that's the iteration that's critical. The iteration inside of your own head doesn't count towards a true iteration.
Great question. Very challenging to deal with the problem of getting away from anything digital at all. And I think if you just keep living with it, you're going to be fine. You won't even realize. There's so much, like I happen to tap into like Google News, and I know everything now, which I don't want to every day. And it's hard. So, but I have two proposals. One is classical and one is more romantic. And I think everybody has a little bit of like each percentages may change. And the classical solution, I'm going to kind of like go ahead and give the drawing system that I developed for PhD as an example, which was not an answer, but a question, and it remains as a question. And it didn't kind of like call the computer 100%, right? So there has been a time that I really didn't want to touch the computer. So that was like my romantic side, I guess, like decision. But at the same time, I always acknowledge, and I use it every day, 7 hours plus, pretty much. So the classical solution for this is, in your profession, in your daily life, as you're running like creative processes or like mundane tasks, can you open a niche by kind of like plugging something into it that's kind of like taking you away from the routine that's mandated by the tool? Morpholio, for instance, is one of them for me, and like I know it from the early times. I think it's kind of acknowledging a lot of things about being human. The romantic side is interesting because I think when you're looking into like too much into the screen, I think we really forget we are humans. There are trees outside, and there's the rain, and there is the sand, and if something blows into your eye, it's going to hurt, and so on and so forth. So it's extremely kind of like helpful. So New Balance has this culture. Most of the company, everybody goes for training in the large time, including myself. We go, we discover our body, like buddies, we are embodied creatures, and then we come back to it, and it makes all the difference. And I think just like walking away is step one. And reading and listening to books is another step, because it kind of like takes your mind away from the thing that you're dealing with and exposes you to some other worlds. Or it's just kind of like wandering, just walk outside in the, a park or forest.
Cool. Yeah, I remember the times when I was in architecture, and you talked about sitting in front of your computer for 7 hours. I think for those that are architects, that's
17.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Yeah. It was like that. Yes.
Yeah. The solutions always came to me at 2:00 in the morning after I had just exited the building, and it was one of those moments where like I'm not going to go back to my desk, because if I go back there, I'm going to be there till sunrise. So I just said, screw it. I'm just going to go home, and hopefully in the cab ride, I can kind of like just sketch it out and remember what I'm doing.
It's
Cool.
also interesting that this look is a reminiscence of the experience we had in the company too. So that's
We go back
17
a little
hours.
bit.
Yes.
Cool. We got one question up here?
I'm enjoying the philosophical discussion, but this is a less philosophical question. It's more about microphone. I'm wondering, going back to your talk, James, you showed some machines, and you guys are an incredibly sophisticated practice, and you showed some machines that seem to be designed, in Alan Turing's day, almost. Do you see the opportunity for a shift in that industry to begin connecting to the design side to sort of begin facilitating these processes? And where do you think that's going to come from?
I mean, it has to come from really the owner, because there are sophisticated contractors and subs out there. It's just that we oftentimes are priced out of the projects. And so when you go with the lowest common denominator, you're not going to get the best quality. So if someone demands certain things like unique panels, that forces a certain sophistication that is going to be a qualification that most subs aren't going to meet. So I think in a lot of ways it's less to do with the industry and more about how we're perceiving value. But as far as the tools go, I mean, we have tools from, our company's 121 years old, and so there's each generation, my boss's Bill, but his father and his father, all purchase tools. And so we have old machines and new machines and kind of this mix. A punch machine that runs on magnetic tape that we've converted. So they were early adopters of these tools and put them into sort of the wild and used them in ways that weren't intended, right? They were intended to be production machines. And so it's going to take some people to be more experimental like that, take on the risk, and Xander takes on a tremendous risk with some of these projects.
I think I'll just follow up since on the New Balance side, I know in the product world and your competitors like Nike, I mean, you're developing your own manufacturing processes, Multimaterial. Do you see an opportunity to come from a sort of different industry and cross-pollinate across industries this sort of momentum towards connecting to computational processes?
Absolutely, yes. I think there's a lot of stuff is happening, and all these companies, I think the very end products or the kind of like the visions are publicized, but inside they're amazing interdisciplinary teams, and it's one of the most interdisciplinary teams that I ever worked with, including MIT. We have in the innovation team 2 architects with generative design backgrounds, other than myself, and then plastics engineers, biomechanical engineers, manufacturing people, and I mean, this is kind of like public information. We have a partnership with Formlabs that was, announced last year. So what I'm finding amazingly interesting for future is, because also the scale is relevant in the kind of like footwear industry. I would like to see a lot of stuff about like materials, because one challenge for every company, I think, is that now foam is very interesting. It's a very traditional old material, but it's super hard to beat, right? So it's just kind of like if you look at the manufacturing, if the way it behaves in terms of support, cushioning, and so on and so forth. So if I have to speculate, the images I just kind of like breezed through, and those are generally like my kind of interpretations of what may happen in the future. I really look forward to seeing like working multi-material printers, right? And also I really look forward to seeing, and the nice thing, the advantage for me in the past was when I first started, not knowing about shoe design, I proposed many silly things, I guess, and they were supported because it was a different way of understanding. So I was like, okay, I walked in, there's the midsole and there's the upper. I'm like, why, right? So, because I didn't know how they were fully manufactured. So our understanding, just to going back to this kind of like seamless, also, it's not fully seamless, but it's becoming seamless from digital to digital design to digital manufacturing. And now we know that it's very different from what it was 10 years ago. We don't have to rationalize and, we don't have to kind of like make everything the same. So what I'm hoping to see is that even opening up that more towards like personal customization, right? Blending the materials and more seamless kind of understanding from human to computer to manufacturing and so on. So this is a big subject, but I'll stop here. Absolutely, yes.
Cool. Can we get a round of applause for our speakers?